Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Kara Bloomberg, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of LandrumHR. For those that are not familiar with LandrumHR, we're a professional services firm with 50 years of serving clients across the country. We provide PEO, or augmented HR services, that include payroll, benefits, workers' compensation, and HR. We also provide worksite management, which is a customized labor solution for companies that use large numbers of temporary workers. Our HRQ division provides 3 integrated services: enterprise-wide human capital consulting, providing interim HR talent, and conducting searches for HR professionals. Our consulting team brings a depth of experience in workforce planning and analytics, talent management, and talent strategy projects, org design, and HR transformation needs. In addition, we provide HR on-call services and virtual learning offerings. You can find out more about all of our services by visiting our websites, LandrumHR.com and HRQinc.com. A few housekeeping items. The recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who registered today. Please feel free to ask questions using the question pane in your control panel. I'm not sure how much time, Amie, that we'll have at the end for live questions, but we'll certainly work to get back to those who asked. And there will be a quick survey that pops up as you exit the webinar today, and we'd appreciate your feedback. It's my pleasure to introduce our General Counsel for LandrumHR, Amie Remington. Amie spent the last 15 years of her career at LandrumHR. She has over 20 years in the employment law arena and is a national speaker on employment law topics. Amie, I know the legal, HR, and compliance teams have been working nonstop this year, assisting our clients with COVID-related legislation and return to work issues. Now we have the election to cover and many of the employment law implications and policy decisions we think will arise as a result. Amie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kara. You're exactly right. This has been the busiest year for employers that I have ever been a part of in all of my career. Between COVID and all the different federal laws and then the PPP loans and now a new election. I mean, gosh, it's been a crazy amount of work for all employers, and our clients, I think, have handled it really, really well, and we've been happy to be there the whole time to hold their hands and help them through it. But we're going to today look forward instead of backwards. We're going to look forward to what we can expect through the next administration. And so let's start with a quick calendar. These are some events that are coming up that employers are going to want to watch. The first is December 8th, which is just a few days away, just around the corner. This is called a cure date, and this is the date when each state must individually certify which of the 2 candidates won the election. So that's an important date, and all expectations are that at the end of the day, the certifications will show that President-elect Biden will be the person that moves forward. And then following that, the Electoral College meets on December 14, and they actually vote for the President of the United States. Now, January 5th is an important day, too, because Georgia is holding a runoff election for 2 Senate seats. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But because it's on this list, though, because those 2 Senate seats do have potential national implications. And then finally, the next day, January 6th of 2021, the new Congress, the Congress that was just voted on earlier in November, will meet for the first time, and they will actually count the votes and declare a winner. And then 2 weeks after that exactly is Inauguration Day. So it's going to be a busy December and January. Lots of news, I'm sure, will follow with those things, but those are the highlights on the calendar event. So let's talk about who is in Congress. And for our longtime clients, they probably heard me go through who our members of Congress were 4 years ago and 8 years ago and 12 years ago, because I think it is important for employers to bear in mind who is actually writing the laws that affect your business. So let's first look at the House. The House of Representatives is made up right now of 222 Democrats and 205 Republicans. And that was actually a net gain of 5 Republicans in the most recent election. So it's likely that the Speaker of the House will be Nancy Pelosi. The Senate is made up of currently 50 Republicans, 46 Democrats, and 2 independents. And it's interesting because the independents caucus with the Democrats, which means right now it's 48 to 50 Democrats to Republicans. So that's why the Georgia Senate runoff seat election is so important. It's very, very unusual that in the same state, both Senate seats are in a runoff. I don't know that that's ever happened in history, but there are 2 Republican incumbents, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, and there's 2 Democratic challengers, John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. Now, if both of the Republican incumbents win, then the Republicans will hold the majority because it will be 48 Democrats to 52 Republicans. If both of the Democrats win in Georgia, then there will be a 50-50 split in the Senate, and they'll be exactly split down the middle. And the reason that's really important is because when that happens, if there is a tie in the Senate, anytime there's a tie in the Senate, the sitting vice president is the tie-breaking vote, and that would be Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. So, and the other thing to note about this is if the Republicans win Georgia, the majority leader will probably remain Senator Mitch McConnell, and if the Democrats win Georgia, the majority leader would then probably become Senator Schumer of New York. So it's interesting that one state runoff can have such national implications, but this year it really does. So that's worthy of watching. And again, that date is January 5th when that election will occur. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was going forward what we might anticipate with if we have a majority leader of Senator Mitch McConnell and President-elect Joe Biden. And the good news for employers and for everybody, I do believe, is that these 2 men have a history of working together very positively. And in fact, just 2 hours ago, an article from The Hill was dropped where President-elect Biden said that he thinks he can work very well with Mr. McConnell. And in the article, he references very specifically back to 2010 and 2012, where he and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell worked together side by side across the aisle to reach a compromise that helped many taxpayers in America. So it doesn't matter, it does matter who wins the runoff, but at the end of the day, the good news for employers is I think that we have 2 leaders who can work together in a way that might work well for everybody. So one of the big things that I think all employers should watch is who is going to lead the key agencies. Every president gets to make presidential appointments to key roles, and these are called Schedule C employees. These are the people who are selected by the president, and they set the president's policies, they set regulations. These are not career staff that don't change from administration to administration. These employees are actually rise and fall with the president, and they're actually policymakers. And there's between 2,000 and 4,000 of these, so there's quite a few of these. But it's important to watch some of the key agencies and what decisions who those will be. So the agencies that I think directly affect employers would be, for example, Treasury, Health and Human Services, the Small Business Administration. Anybody who got a PPP loan will probably agree with that. And of course, the Department of Labor, which is probably the most important. One thing that President-elect Biden has said very clearly is that his cabinet will reflect America's diversity. So, for example, we already have a selection for a Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and Avril Haines was previously the Deputy National Advisor under President Obama. And then we already have an envoy for climate change, and that's Senator John Kerry. It's a name that most people recognize. We have somebody who's going to lead the Department of Homeland Security already, Alejandro Majoret. He's an immigrant and he's a Latino. And then Ron Kwan is going to be Mr. Biden's chief of staff. And that is a name you might remember because under President Obama, he was considered the Ebola czar. He handled all of the U.S.'s response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So those are probably some familiar names. But the name that really all employers need to be very familiar with is who is going to lead the Department of Labor. And let me tell you the why first. The Secretary of Department of Labor is, in my opinion, probably the single most important person for employers in the United States. We have in the United States over 180 federal employment laws or different laws that regulate employment in some manner, maybe benefits, maybe wage and hour, maybe safety, but there's about 180 different federal employment laws. And it governs over 150 million workers in America and over 10 million workplaces. So the Secretary of the United States Department of Labor has a huge job. And the Department of Labor is made up of many, many divisions. I think there's about 38 different divisions. Key among those is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, the Wage and Hour Division, which has jurisdiction over almost every employer in the United States and handles everything to do with the dollars that you pay employees for work. The National Labor Relations Board, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which governs OSHA, and the OFCCP, which is the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. And that is the agency that handles any affirmative action plans, or if you're a federal contractor, they would oversee the work that you do on behalf of the federal government. So those are some of the bigger parts of the Department of Labor that have direct effect on employers. And so the big topic of conversation is who is going to be the secretary. And one of the names that you have probably heard thrown out is Bernie Sanders. He has been pretty open about his desire for the position. Another name that has been thrown out pretty recently is Boston Mayor Marty Walsh. He is a former official of the labor union, and he's very well supported by the AFL-CIO. But just yesterday, new information to me, Representative Abby Finkelnauer from Iowa was released as a candidate for consideration. She's 32 years old. She is the second youngest woman ever to be elected to Congress. And if she's selected by Mr. Biden, she would be the youngest ever member of a presidential cabinet. By way of background, her father was a union pipe fitter and welder, so she grew up in a union household. And I think knowing who the Secretary of the Department of Labor is and where they come from is very, very important, because I think all of these people, having either been a former official of the laborers union or growing up in a union household, or like Mr. Sanders being very open about his support of unions, it is very likely that the secretary will come from a pro-union standpoint. And they might have some pro-union or pro-labor policies, because again, these are policymakers. These aren't just people who enact prior policies. These are people who create and carve out. They're the manufacturers of the policies that employers work under during the administration. So one of the things that I think will happen, if I were a betting person, I would put money on the fact that the Department of Labor's audit enforcement mechanism will either increase or stay the same, but it will not decline. So all the different agencies that we're going to talk about in a moment, as we talk about these, bear in mind that they all have enforcement mechanisms, they all have enforcement teams, they all have attorneys, and they can all sue individual employers on behalf of the Department of Labor. And I think that those enforcement mechanisms will grow more robust during the next 4 years under a Biden administration. So let's start with safety and OSHA. During the election, President-elect Biden made it very clear that employee safety was a top priority. I think that we will be appointing an OSHA leader very, very quickly. And I think that agency will be very proactive very quickly. So it's interesting because under the past 4 years and under the Trump administration, OSHA enforcement has actually been at an all-time low. OSHA has done fewer inspections in the past 4 years than it did in the 49 years prior to that. So I think that while we've had a low number of inspections during the past 4 years, we're going to see those numbers increase significantly over the coming 4 years. The other thing is the penalties over the past 4 years have been a bit relaxed. The dollars haven't changed necessarily, but they haven't really been enforced or fined as much. And I think we're going to see, it's very, very likely that employers are going to see more penalties and more citations on a more frequent basis. So this is a great time for employers, particularly if you're a manufacturer or you're in an area where there's lots of machinery, to go ahead and talk to your human resources, talk to your safety people, and ask some questions to make sure that you're complying with all of the OSHA standards. For example, if you have MSDS sheets that you're required to have posted or available, make sure those are posted and available. If you have employees who are required to wear eyewear or footwear, or if your machinery needs to be maintained at a certain rate, go ahead and provide that eyewear or the footwear, and go ahead and make sure that your machineries are safe. It's a great time to audit your internal organization and your facilities to make sure that you are OSHA compliant. The next part is the National Labor Relations Board. And I often have employers say, well, gosh, I'm not a union organization, so the NLRB doesn't apply to me. But it does. The National Labor Relations Board has jurisdiction over almost every single employer, all 10 million in the United States, regardless of whether they have a union or not. And so that's often people make that mistake and they kind of brush off the NLRB in the National Labor Relations Act as well, because they think, gosh, it doesn't pertain to me, but it does. And the way the board is made up, there's 5 members of the board. On the board, 3 are always members of the current administration, and 2 are the other party. So currently, under the Trump administration, there's 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Under a Biden administration, it'll be exactly the opposite, and that's the way it's always been. Now, one thing that's important to note is that organized labor over the past 15 years has continued to steadily, slowly decrease in the private sector. But given President-elect Biden's goal of clean energy, it's very possible that organized labor might become more powerful, since clean energy is necessarily a manufacturing issue. So currently it's about 7 to 8% of private sector businesses that are unionized, but that number could go up. The other reason that number could go up is because those of us who talked at the last election 4 years ago talked a lot about the Employee Free Choice Act, and we said, well, gosh, that's probably something we're not going to have to worry about under the Trump administration, and it really wasn't. But just to refresh your memory, the Employee Free Choice Act was a proposal that was put forth by the Democrats during the Obama administration, and it provided some things like quickie elections, which is exactly what it sounds like. It makes it easier and quicker to do elections, to unionize a workforce. It provided for, it replaced the secret ballot elections with card checks, which is where instead of having a secret ballot where nobody knows how you have voted, instead you just are handed basically like an index card. You check a box, yes or no, and there's no secret about it. So that was the Employee Free Choice Act under the Obama administration. And like I said, it didn't really see the light of day during the Trump administration, but I fully expect that to get dusted off and to come back in some form over the next, it could be over the next 2 years or maybe after the next round of elections, but it might look like the Employee Free Choice Act, or it might look like the PRO Act, which was a pro-union bill that was passed in the House back in February, but it was not passed in the Senate. So the PRO Act may be resurrected. And the PRO Act actually goes a little farther than the Employee Free Choice Act. It actually provides criminal penalties for labor law violations. It does the same thing with the ballots, where it's not a secret ballot, but it's a card check. And it also has a provision in there that says that if the employer and the employees cannot reach a mutual agreement on collective bargaining language, that the union will go ahead and do that. So it's very pro-union. So I don't know if that bill will be resurrected, but I think employers need to be very aware that union activity may increase. So you need to evaluate what you can do if a union is not what you desire, what you can do to be the best employer you can be so that employees don't feel it necessary to form a union. And then finally, the NLRB also, back during the Obama administration in 2012, was very, very active on what an employer could and could not do in response to an employee's behavior on social media. Again, not a lot of action on that in the past 4 years, but in the next 4 years, I think that's going to be a hot topic again, and I know we will be talking about it quite a bit coming forward to keep everybody informed on what you need to know with respect to social media. So let's move now to the wage and hour division, because if you pay an employee $1, and everybody on this call does, this division has jurisdiction over you. There are very, very few organizations over whom this division does not have jurisdiction. Now, President-elect Biden campaigned on the federal increase of the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. But here's the thing. The federal minimum wage is set by statute, which means Congress has to act. So a president unilaterally can't change the federal minimum wage. Instead, the legislature, the Congress has to do that. And that's another reason the Georgia race matters, because to increase the federal minimum wage as high as 15, it will probably need a Democrat majority to change the Fair Labor Standards Act. If I had a crystal ball and I were placing a bet, I would bet that there will be some increase to the federal minimum wage, but not up to $15 an hour. I think there's bipartisan support for the idea that $7.25 is not a sufficient minimum wage, but something between that and $15 an hour is a lot more likely for Congress to agree on, regardless of whether Congress is a Democrat or a Republican majority. Now, of course, some states have already done this. Some states, like Florida, did it through a constitutional amendment in the last election, which was super, super interesting because Florida voted as a state for Trump during the last election, but also voted to increase the minimum wage. So it was interesting to see the different issues as we went down the ballot in the state of Florida. Now, the other thing is there is likely to be some sort of law that mirrors, that looks like a California law governing wage theft protection. And there's a New York law that's similar to that. But what that says, what those laws tend to say is that if an employee's wages are changed, the employee is entitled to written notice. So if you give somebody a raise, or if you give somebody a decrease in pay, or if you change some benefits, maybe reimbursements or bonus structures or things like that, that you have to give a notice, a written notice to employees so that they are well informed. So I bet we'll see something along the lines of Federal Wage Theft Protection Act. Of course, misclassification is something that we talked about a lot during the Obama administration. And by that, I mean failing to pay people overtime, misclassifying them as an exempt employee when they should be a non-exempt employee. And I think we will definitely see that again, but we're going to see it in a slightly different nuance as well. It is going to be textured more like a gig economy issue. And what I mean by that is in California, there's an ABC test. You might have heard about Prop 22, which makes it more difficult for gig organizations to satisfy and show that a person is actually an independent contractor rather than an employee. So some organizations that are today gig organizations who classify their current employees, their current people as independent contractors may be forced to reclassify them as employees. And in doing so, then they have FICA, FUTA, SUTA obligations, workers' comp obligations, Title VII obligations, and all the other obligations that come along with being an employer as opposed to running an organization made up entirely of independent contractors. So again, I think misclassification will be a hot issue, but I think it will be nuanced slightly differently. And if that weren't enough on wage and hour, I really expect that there should be some sort of Paycheck Fairness Act. This was previously started under President Obama, and it addressed the wage discrimination on the basis of sex. And the goal was to reduce the pay gap. Many states have already started this. Colorado is an example of that. Colorado has a state statute that governs pay equity based on race. Based on gender. But the other thing with respect to gender is looking for pay equity with the EEO-1. So if you're over 100 employees, the EEO-1 currently requires that you report a certain number of employees and the types of classifications that they are. I would expect that we will begin to see that EEOC issue more regulations where race and gender will also be criteria, because the EEOC will be looking for pay disparities to see if certain groups of people are paid more than others or are hired at different levels than other groups of people. So California's already done this. Senate Bill 973 mandates this reporting at the state level already. So I fully expect to see something about this. Now, the good news is because many employers don't have a mechanism to record this data at this time, unless you're already over 100 employees, it's not something that would happen like the flip of a light switch. Instead, it's something that if it happened through law or through a statute, you would have a certain amount of time to get up to speed. So it's not something to worry about your systems today. Instead, it's something to anticipate for tomorrow. The Affordable Care Act was a huge topic of conversation during the election. I don't think that anybody could turn on the news on any given day and not hear about the Affordable Care Act. But the interesting thing to me is that when you drill down to the Affordable Care Act, it becomes a Supreme Court issue more than an election issue. So just like I said earlier with the Fair Labor Standards Act and the increase in minimum wage, a president cannot unilaterally change minimum wage. Well, the president unilaterally cannot change the Affordable Care Act. It has to be done through the Supreme Court unless the law is changed. So President-elect Biden promised to preserve protections for pre-existing conditions. I mean, that was a big portion of the campaign. And interestingly, less than a month ago, the United States Supreme Court heard an oral argument in a case called U.S. versus Texas. And the issue was whether the individual mandate of the ACA was constitutional when the individual mandate now has no penalty attached to it for failure to comply. So if I have a plan, or if I fail to have a plan and I don't follow the individual mandate, but there's no penalty for me, then does the entire ACA fall? And that's the issue before the Supreme Court. Does the remainder of the entire ACA stand, or does the whole thing fall if there's no penalty attached? Because remember, the reason it was propped up constitutionally is because it was a tax issue. So a decision is expected from the Supreme Court, and a lot of times on huge decisions like that, even though the court's in session from October to June, Often it's like Labor Day weekend, or I'm sorry, Memorial Day weekend, right before June 1 when those decisions come out. So we'll have to see what happens. And the other thing, just real quickly on benefits in general, is that I would expect to see President-elect Biden really work with Congress to expand opportunities for small employers to help employees save for retirement, and to increase. We've heard a lot about taxes during the election, but I would expect the president to work with Congress to increase Social Security taxes, but only for those exceptionally high wage earners, with the goal of creating long-run solvency for the Social Security Administration. So those are some things on retirement savings that we're going to want to watch as time goes on. So paid leave was also a very hot topic during the election. Just as I was preparing for this just an hour ago, I looked to see what the status of this was, and I found about 5 different articles from different news sources that talked about how the pandemic disproportionately affected women, and specifically that some between 800,000 and 1 million women had to leave the workforce entirely, as in not just temporarily lose their job, but leave the workforce, exit the workforce entirely to stay home and care for children, as those children were homeschooling and virtual schooling. And another report said that there were 4 times as many women who dropped out of the labor force entirely as did men. And I think President-elect Biden recognizes this, and that appears to be what he has said during the campaign, and he favors some sort of leave, 12-week period of paid leave for all workers. It would probably look similar to the FMLA, the current Family and Medical Leave Act, which says that to qualify, you have to have worked for an employer for 12 months or 1,250 hours over the course of a year, and your employer has to be 50 employees or more. And so I expect that there will be some sort of expansion of this. It may not be the full 12 weeks for all employees in all types of organizations. We'll just have to wait and see what happens, but that also requires some congressional action as well. So getting away from the Department of Labor, let's talk about consumer privacy, because consumer privacy is a really big topic right now across the globe, not just in the United States. So Europe has the GDPR, which is the European version of a law that protects consumer privacy on the internet. So if you plug in your credit card number, if you provide your date of birth, the European GDPR has very, very strict standards on how an organization may collect the information, what they must do with it, and how they must wipe it if you request that they wipe the information. So in the United States, we don't have a global's not a good word. We don't have a large federal response on this yet. But I do believe that both the Democrats and the Republicans all agree that consumer privacy and avoiding hacking of all types of organizations, whether it's products for sale, whether it's securities, whether it's your company's personal information, whether it's your company's personnel information, that all of this information should be safe. I do believe there will be a Democrat and a Republican response on that. Now, states have dealt with this where the federal government hasn't yet. So, for example, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California when California enacted many privacy regulations to protect consumers. So the California regulation is called the California Consumer Privacy Act. And for all of our California listeners today, I'm sure that they could talk for a very long time on how thorough this act is, but it really modernizes the idea that so much information is available via employers, their computer portals, networks, intranets, internet, and all of those types of things. So I do believe consumer privacy will be a very, very hot topic. So let's talk about COVID, because unfortunately, when we started doing these webinars back in March, I would have never thought we would be talking about COVID again in December, but we are, so we'll talk about COVID. So COVID response was Biden's top initiative in his campaign speeches. Constantly talked about COVID, getting it under control, and helping bring America's health back. One thing that has been talked about with respect to America's financial health is more CARES types of loans. Now remember that CARES was the Coronavirus Response Act, and it was the federal law that was enacted that created the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. And I know many of our clients sought PPP loans and got PPP loans, and that was a big help in keeping your businesses afloat during a time when maybe you had to shut down entirely or shut down partially because of state or federal guidelines. I would not be surprised at all if the new Congress issues more PPP types of loans and tax credits to continue to help businesses. One thing that might change, so under the CARES Act, which remember we talked a lot about the Small Business Administration and Section 7 of the SBA, which had the necessity provision, so that to get a loan under the CARES Act, well, to get a loan under the SBA normally, you have to show a business necessity. So in other words, you can't get an SBA loan unless you can't get it elsewhere. So you've exhausted all your other remedies, you can't get a loan, so you go through the SBA. Well, that provision was taken out of the CARES Act, so it wasn't necessary that you exhaust all efforts, and instead, all employers of certain sizes were qualified. All they had to do was apply and provide all of that financial background and data to show that they were qualified, but it wasn't a necessity qualification. So if I had a crystal ball, I would bet that the stricter regulations regarding the necessity of the loans, if there is a second round of CARES or PPP, that necessity portion will be put back in, so it will only be available to businesses that literally would shut their doors and would make more Americans unemployed without the help of the federal government. Now, currently, organizations which receive the CARES Act PPP loan are not eligible for the Employee Retention Tax Credit. Remember, that's the Jonathan Taylor told you about that. He talked about the fact that that was a refundable tax credit equal to 50% of the wages paid to employees. So currently, you can't get both. If you get a PPP loan, you don't get the Employee Retention Tax Credit. But there seems to be some bipartisan support for allowing, in whatever second round looks like, an organization to seek both. So we'll just have to see what happens with that and watch that carefully. And then finally, masking. Masking is a very intense issue. A lot of people have very personal feelings on this. The CDC's recommendations as of this morning is that all people continue to wear masks in all sorts of public settings. And it specifically says mass transportation, events and gatherings, indoors and outdoors, and anywhere you'll be around groups of people. So that's the CDC's recommendation. Now the state, and there's no federal law on masks, but that's the CDC's recommendation. But since there's no federal laws, states and municipalities have set their own rules and their own regulations. So for example, in New York City, as of September, and a person could get a $1,000 fine for having gatherings or violating the rules regarding masking and gathering with too many people. And in fact, just yesterday, I read an article about a wedding at a synagogue in New York City. It had 7,000 attendees, and the city fined the synagogue $15,000 for violating all of the protocols regarding masks and gatherings. But what I wonder is if the synagogue will challenge this in light of the Supreme Court's recent decision blocking New York religious restrictions, because New York's religious restrictions, the synagogue would argue, violate the free exercise clause of the Constitution. So I don't know if the states can certainly set rules for non-religious settings, but I don't know if New York went too far in setting it to include all organizations, including religious settings, or if that's going to be a carve-out. So we'll have to see what happens with that. The Supreme Court seems to say that there's a carve-out for that. But even down to non-municipalities, and I'll give you one example of a university. Florida State University has a rule where they argue that they own the entire campus, they own all the acreage, and they say that if you are on their acreage and you are a faculty, student, or staff, that you have to wear a mask if you're in a building, a residence hall, or even if you're on campus. So if you're anywhere on their acreage, you have to have a mask on. And at the beginning of the semester, when some of the students didn't take that very seriously, President John Thrasher sent all students an email saying if they violate a rule, they will be suspended for a semester. And to emphasize how serious he was, he sent the CDC director, Robert Redfield, to encourage the school to continue with mask requirements. And so the long and the short of the reason I say all this is because I think employers should very well anticipate continued mask requirements and maybe even increased mask requirements as we continue through the month of December and the colder months of January and February. So, Kara, we have some takeaways, and our key takeaways were we wanted all employers to be very aware of the Georgia Senate races. We wanted all employers to watch for the appointment of the Secretary of the Department of Labor, because I think that's going to be super, super important. And then of that, as I said, the wage and hour division is probably has the most effect on individual employers. So we want to see who that administrator will be. And then we still have a whole lot of resources that are available through our LandrumHR blogs and our articles. These are all, we try to keep them as up to date as possible, but it seems sometimes as the information comes out faster than we can keep it up. But the links are live, and I think these will be very helpful resources for all employers.
Yeah, Amie, I agree. All of the links are you can go to our website too, LandrumHR.com, HRQinc.com has some good information and some information on our events there through HRQ. So definitely a lot of resources out there and ever changing. Interesting to go back, because I know we have a library of all of our old webinars to go back and listen to those, and how just amazingly fast things have changed over the last few months and evolved in the legislation and policy making. So, Amie, I'm guessing we're going to be we'll be back quickly, right, to do additional webinars as all of these decisions start to come forth. And I know we have a poll we wanted to just ask here and get some information from our attendees if they'd be willing to answer a poll question for us. And the question is, are you concerned about the potential impacts of new legislation and new regulations on your business? Yes, no, or unsure? Quite frankly, Amie, I don't know how an employer after hearing all of your topics could answer no. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. And I think, Monica, you'll have to close that out and once we give a few seconds here and show us the results.
Yeah, I think even if employers aren't nervous about it, employers would be remiss not to be very aware of all of the changes. Because even if you're doing everything right, you still need to know about all these changes. They're still all relevant, whether you have 5 employees or 505 employees. They're all relevant.
Yeah, I think we're often talking about, certain things with the Department of Labor. Hey, there's no good answer if I didn't know that. I wasn't aware. That's not a good excuse with the Department of Labor if they come knocking on the door, for sure. So looks like overwhelmingly, yeah, looks like overwhelmingly yes. concerned about the potential impacts. And of course, that's, I think, how we assumed that would go. But, we'll be here through the whole process of the next couple of months and really getting some of these final decisions and seeing what happens as far as the next steps. And Amie, I know your team, the compliance group, HR, just been working around the clock for the last few months, and appreciate all your hard work of keeping us informed and up to speed. So for everyone at LandrumHR and HRQ, thanks for attending today. Please take a second to do our survey as we check out of here, and happy end of 2020 and happy holidays to everyone.